Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel, The Wild and the Domesticated, which will explore different manners in which human actions and perceptions drastically affect the lives, as well as death, of animals in different changing spheres. As we'll see, even the mere categories of wild and domesticated are politically and culturally charged and are arguably not as dichotomous as one might think. So we have terrific speakers with us who will lead us through the intersections of ethical, historical, and cultural considerations, which are essential for reimagining and reshaping these boundaries, perhaps, and relationships. The panel will include 3 presentations, followed by a discussion and Q&A. You're most welcome to write down your questions and comments in the chat box during the presentations. When you're doing that, please write to whom you're addressing your comment or question. I'm glad to invite our first presenter for this panel, Zuzana Velenská from Charles University in Prague. Zuzana, can you please share your presentation?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I will share my presentation. So, hello to everybody. Today I will talk about the problem of liminal animals as a repercussion of the Anthropocene. This presentation explores the issue of liminal animals and their status in the Anthropocene. I will present contemporary scholar contributions to animal-human connectivity and of liminal animals in order to provide understanding how humans have affected and been affected by liminal animals. So, liminal animals are wild and domestic species who live on anthropogenic food sources and share their living spaces with humans. These animals have changed their natural behavior and have adapted to live near human habitat. This provides them with several benefits, but also puts them at high risk. Several usual wild animals, such as foxes, raccoons, badgers, monkeys, opossums, pigeons, rats, etc., can be liminal, but the most significant liminal animals are stray cats and dogs. Nature of these previously domesticated species, which are now stray, have changed twice. As wild animals, they had been domesticated and then rewilded again. These animals also affect human emotions and attitudes the most. Liminal animals are mostly omnivores, such as raccoons, foxes, dogs. That means that they are attracted to same kind of food like humans. I will talk about history of liminal animals now. That can be encountered near cities that is beneficial to understanding this multi-species interconnectivity issue. Also, liminal animals had been part of life for centuries. It was not until the mid-19th centuries that serious efforts were made to relieve the suffering of homeless animals. A brief historical overview of liminal animals during modern history will enable us to reflect contemporary situation of feral, stray, and pest animals. It will also provide possible future prospects. In 1387, an edict stated that dogs shall not wander in London at large, so the difference between wild and wandering dogs and pets was established quite early. But whereas today strays in Europe are collected by wardens and taken to homes, in the past they would have been caught and destroyed, adopted by kind souls, or left to freely roam. As evidence of strays being rounded up and killed, the first attempt to control the Great Plague was a clampdown of the movement of cats and dogs. They were believed to be the most likely animal carriers of the disease above rats and mice. Strays were often the targets of cruel abuse. As shown in Hogarth's The 4 Stages of Cruelty. Stray dogs were also lured by the dog snatcher to sell on the streets, to be skinned or sold on the onto the vivisector. Back in the mid-17th century, the dogs and cats may have landed in the hands of the early London scientists who used stray animals to experiment on. The idea of a refugee for stray dogs, where dogs could be claimed by their owners or sold on if appropriate, was first proposed in September 1860. One of the supporters of the human effort of such institution was, for example, Charles Dickens. He wrote of the dichotomy that existed in the world of the London dog. At one end were pampered pooches of the wealthy being exhibited at the dog shows, while at the other end was shelters for lost dogs. Large numbers of dogs were traditionally received at the new year when the dog licenses became due. The Second World War saw panicked owners bringing their dogs in to be put down. Actually, it was 400,000 in 1939. I will talk about liminal animals now. On one hand, liminal animals such as foxes, raccoons, badgers, or stray cats and dogs attract people who like encountering and feeding them. On the other hand, can liminal animals threaten personal safety, similar to the past, when serious hygienic and epidemic issues have been linked to strays? Local governments still employ lethal, non-ethical solutions to this problem, although it makes both fiscal and ethical sense to develop sterilization programs as a means of humanely curbing overpopulation. I would like to highlight how now a human response to liminal animals benefits for the environment, the community, and of course those animals. According to Dorothea Fritz, the massive problem of the stray animals and that exist in some countries can be solved providing suitable management methods. The Italian animal welfare organization Lega Pro Animale operates in the south of the country, a region with a very severe stray problem. Their experiences have shown that certain management methods can, over a period of time, produce dramatic reductions in stray populations. The primary objective of stray management should be to keep the population of dogs and cats in a particular area down to a level where there is no need to destroy healthy and friendly animals, but without accumulating them in kennels. How this is achieved largely depends on the initial situation. In general, in an area where there is a balance between the numbers of incoming animals and losses through rehoming and natural death, no major problem exists. For example, the current situation with dogs in Germany or in Czech Republic. In such circumstances, kennels have a function as a transitory shelter. I will talk about the responses to a stray or liminal animals problem. Now, the various responses to a problem of an excessive population of strays in an area can be categorized as follows. I will find the slide, yeah. Ignoring the problem, killing the excess animals, rehoming and locating them into kennels, influencing the holding capacity, then registration and identification of the animals, spaying and neutering programs, educating programs. Ignoring the problem. In many places, the authorities are not really interested in the stray animal problem. Nobody takes responsibility, even if there is a law prescribing what to do. In such circumstances, the logical consequences would be that the stray animal population would get even worse. But it doesn't happen because there are limiting factors. These are the availability of food, water, and shelter. Thus, if a fixed quantity of food and water is available at a certain location, and there is adequate shelter for the animals to protect themselves against the weather and enemies, there will be a fixed maximum number of animals living there. This is known as the holding or carrying capacity. The individuals in these groups will not always be the same, but the number will stay roughly constant. Another objective is killing the excess animals. For many years, all over the world, authorities and animal protection organizations have considered that the only way to get the stray overflow problem under control was through killing. It is clear that the killing is not working. It does not reduce the total number of dogs or cats in the area in a permanent way. Eliminating the overflow by killing removes the symptom, but will never remove the problem. Remaining animals will refill the territory by producing youngs. This is a typical problem for places like Sao Paulo, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern countries. It is not possible to catch all the stray animals in territory within the breeding time. So the total population will rise again to the holding capacity. Rehoming and taking unwanted animals to kennels or shelters. For example, in Germany, animal welfare organizations managed to rehome nearly all of the unwanted animals taken into their shelters, even if they are old or handicapped. Some of these organizations even help others, particularly in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, by taking dogs and cats from there to rehome with families. In Germany or in Czech Republic, there are no dogs on the streets. However, stray cat problem is becoming apparent in several, especially rural locations. This solution does not solve the problem, as the holding capacity of the place remains the same. New stray will occur. What really works is influencing the holding capacity. It is very difficult to influence certain aspects of the holding capacity. For example, the supply of water is largely in the hands of nature. Also, animals can be very resourceful in finding alternative sources of water and shelters. The only parameter that can be seriously influenced is the food supply. In this respect, some simple remedies are available. For example, authorities should manage the rubbish problem properly, collect it regularly, use closable rubbish containers, fence off rubbish dumps, and educate the population. But where people and authorities permit dumping of rubbish in the streets, liminal animals will settle down. Spaying and neutering and returning programs, this also is really helpful. Legal per animales experience in Italy shows that it's particularly puppies and kittens that are abandoned or taken into kennels. These are the offsprings of pets whose owners do not know what to do with them. Thus, by removing the source of more births, the owners hope not to have any further problems. To reduce this common behavior, free spaying and neutering could be offered to the pet owners. The only possible way to permanently reduce the total population is the use of a spay, neuter, and return programs in hand with reducing the rubbish and accessibility of food. It is also important to inform and educate people. If children experience their parents abandoning animals, it is more likely that they will do the same when they grow up. If they could better understand animals' needs, they might improve their attitude. A proper registration and identification system will also help to prevent animals from being abandoned. This is because the owners can be traced and ideally will have to pay a fine for abandoning. However, it cannot prevent the abandoning of puppies and kittens itself. Liminal animals as a problem, not all liminal animals represent a problem. Actually, they are problematic only when overpopulated. Previously, wild animals that have changed their naturalness into liminal animals living on anthropogenic food sources like raccoons, red badgers, opossums, etc., have gained different status and management. They are not being rehomed, sheltered into kennels, or spay and neuter like cats and dogs. Widespread option is to reduce their numbers by killing them, which is unethical and ineffective and also expensive. For example, at tourist sites, they are usually being massively killed before tourist season. Influencing the holding capacity, that means reducing food resources. This is also helpful. As we already mentioned, the only parameter that can be seriously influenced is the food supply. Authorities should manage the rubbish problem properly. Where people and authorities permit dumping of rubbish in the streets, liminal animals will settle down, as has been already said. For example, the best way you can stop raccoons from trespassing onto your property is to remove all the things that are attracting them in the first place. People should seal up or remove sources of food, water, and shelter. And also information and education. Children should be educated how to manage waste, why to use closable rubbish containers, how to fence off rubbish dumps. So I think this is the end of my presentation. I'll show these references. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zuzana. Yeah, this was very interesting, I think, both in terms of observing this as a simultaneously global and a local phenomenon, and also in terms of addressing human response and responsibilities in this context. And I think it's also an interesting transition to our next speaker, who's Bjørn Kristensen from the University of Oregon. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yeah, it's great, Amin. Thanks. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
So you can go ahead and share your slides and start the presentation. Thanks.
Right. That look okay?
Yes.
All right, great.
The floor is yours.
Cool. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to present here. I will just go ahead and get started right away. Domestication is often understood to be a distinct category from which we can clearly designate that some animals belong and some do not. So in this project, I'm looking at pathways towards domestication to help us better understand contemporary cases in which animals that are typically perceived as wild may actually be entangled within a process of domestication. So a key point I'm putting forward is that many contemporary wild animals that live among humans may be said to be proto-domesticates, regardless of whether there's an intentional project to bring about such an end. So I conclude with the claim that we should not be dismissive of this, nor should we see domestication as an inherently problematic or exploitive power dynamic. Rather, we might understand it as indicative of dependencies that are emerging from an ever more anthropogenically modified world that we can strive toward being more intentionally engaged in. So the binary between wild and domesticated animals misrepresents or outright dismisses many, and by some accounts, most non-human animals. So that's especially the case with those who have adapted significantly to living among humans. In the context of the US, we might think about like urban species like squirrels, raccoons, mice, rats. In Israel, we could look at like rock hyraxes in Jerusalem or wild boars in Haifa. But there are countless examples of this. And also the notion of domestication that's being put forward by a lot of thinkers is also static and reductive. So consider what have been called extinctionist claims among some animal rights-based approaches to animals. So Gary Francione, for example, frames domestication as being inherently exploitative due to its connection to the property status of animals and those sort of power dynamic that humans have over animals through domestication. So on his account, an essential step is to stop perpetuating the cycle of domestication. So to remove ourselves from further influence and the further modification of other species. So ultimately what this would mean is the gradual extinction of domesticated animals, many of whom have been modified from their once wild ancestors to the degree that they are incapable of living fully autonomous lives, independent of humans. We might also look at David Nybert's, sociologist David Nybert's statement. So in his book, Animal Oppression, Human Violence, he states, over the past 10,000 years, human lives and those of other animals have been shaped indelibly and tragically by the priorities and interests of elite groups in their societies. These customs and practices that serve their interest include the much touted process of domestication of other animals, from which human civilization and advancement allegorically spring. So the emphasis here is clearly that domestication is necessarily exploitative. And it's, it involves this unequal power dynamic. So yet I want to claim, and I think it's rightfully the case, that there's not one path to domestication. While it might be said that many domesticated animals are indeed victims of intense forms of exploitation, which neglect to take their interests seriously, this is not the full story, and it's actually often secondary to the processes of domestication themselves. So assuming that we can choose to no longer perpetuate the sort of morally problematic cycle of domestication misses the full picture. Indeed, as I claim, it may not even be possible or in the interests of many animals themselves for humans to avoid engaging in processes of domestication if our lives are going to necessarily intersect with one another. And this is perhaps especially the case in regard to what are termed anthrodependent species. And these are commensal species which are living in relatively close proximity to humans in the context of anthropogenic environments in which they've developed sort of dependencies on those circumstances. And just to state about one case about domesticated animals that they all kind of share is that this most unified feature is that all domesticates have a sort of increased comfort or lack of stress in the presence of humans. And this is usually distinct from their wild counterparts. As Driscoll et al. State in this quote I put up here, all domesticates manifest a remarkable tolerance of or proximity to people, lack of fear around humans. So I want to look at the one pathway to domestication. So a couple pathways. I'm going to start with the directed pathway, and the directed pathway is likely the pathway to domestication that many are intuitively thinking of when they're criticizing domestication. So thinkers like Francione and Nybert are probably thinking of this kind of pathway. And so a directed pathway tends to be seen as an intentional pathway. However, it's also the case that it's not entirely the case that it's intentional, and I'll explain that. So a directed pathway occurs within human communities who have previously engaged in a prey pathway. And so an example of a prey pathway to domestication would be hunting strategies which have increasingly brought wild animals into more and more controlled situations. So we can think of cattle and the development of pastoral societies in the Sahara, for example, which led to a form of herd management of animals that were once hunted, potentially, right? So the directed pathway follows from the prey pathway in that it's involving humans who have previously domesticated animals. However, what's different in the case of the directed pathway is it takes on a more explicit intent in directing these animals from the start. So while the prey pathway generally involved animals who were consumed as well, many animals domesticated through the directed pathway were not domesticated primarily for the sake of their consuming their flesh or their milk. And donkeys are a prime example of this. So donkeys descended either from the Nubian or the Somali wild ass would have been preferable for transportation purposes in parts of Africa where they were domesticated. The wild asses that they descended from were intelligent and they were capable of surviving in harsh climates like the Sahara. And they could get by in a diverse diet and limited water. And so while the domestication of donkeys from the wild ass was almost certainly an intentional decision on the part of Saharan pastoralists, not every aspect of their domestication was intentional. And this is important. So since the features that the wild ass already possess, namely their strength and their ability to survive in harsh climates, as well as their intelligence, were capacities that humans didn't want to lose in these animals, donkeys were not bred to lose these features in their domestication. And so their changes were actually small, apart from their conditioning to be more comfortable around humans. So many pastoral cultures did not herd or keep donkeys penned up like other livestock. Not only were donkeys typically not as valuable as many other animals pastoralists had, but they were also capable of surviving on their own. Typically, they were not heavily managed. And so domesticated donkeys were allowed to roam free often. And so sometimes they were even encouraged to interbreed with wild asses to retain desired features of their wild relatives. So what this means is that the donkey's status, in combination with the desire of humans to maintain much of their wild capacities, led to humans modifying the donkeys slightly in their domestication. Yet they may have simultaneously modified large portions or perhaps the entire population of wild asses as a result of the interaction between these domesticated animals and wild animals. So the directed pathway clearly emphasizes the directed control of animals for a specific purpose, but often not the entire control of the animal. So in fact, if humans were able to recognize desired features in wild animals that made them attractive candidates for domestication, as with the wild ass, then it seems obvious that part of the motivation for domestication in this case is specifically not to lose those wild characteristics. So therefore, we might say that the directed pathway in this particular instance was an intentional choice to condition animals so as to allow for an openness or freedom for unintentional processes to inevitably be carried out by these animals. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about the commensal pathway. So this is probably the earliest and presumably the most common pathway to domestication. So commensalism is understood as a relationship between two organisms which benefits one generally without harming the other. And in most cases, the commensal pathway comes about from animals who are attracted to entering human settlements due to the availability of a food source of some kind. The desire to access this food source then leads the animal as well as humans to become more and more comfortable around each other. And eventually, these largely unintentional processes lead to direct intentional cooperation between humans and other animals. So I want to be clear here too, that while the relationship between humans and the species in question in this commensal pathway, it may be mutualistic at some point. This does often develop into an exploitative power dynamic on the part of humans over the species at some point. So for example, right, the chickens are a commensal species and this has led to industrialized farming of chickens, right? I'm not justifying that. I'm just trying to give a, an overview of the history here. So the commensal pathway does indicate, though, however, that at some point animals did enter into the domestication process on their own sort of accord, whereas in the directed pathway, the process was almost certainly something that was forced upon the species by humans. Okay. So this is the title I actually wanted to use for the paper. This is to me, this is the most interesting part. I want to consider the habitation of wild animals within urban spaces. And so these are not just like raccoons, squirrels, the rock hyrax, the wild boar, and so forth. I want to say there's also a lot of cases of threatened species that live in these contexts. And so a species which I've had the opportunity to do research on and field work on is the critically endangered European hamster. And there's significant populations of this species that live in urban environments in Central and Western Europe. And their current struggle is due to numerous anthropogenic impacts, including agricultural landscape modification, increased urbanization, climate change, and unintentional genetic selection that occurred because of past hunting and fur trapping of them. But their successful adaptation to urban green areas is most profound in Vienna, Austria, where the largest population in Central Europe resides. So the successful presence of the European hamster within urban green spaces is widely recognized as a form of commensalism. They have certainly changed significantly as a species as a result of their urbanization. And this includes changes in the typical times of day that they're active due to the presence of nocturnal predators as a threat. They're significantly less reproductively active than their ancestors. And the presence of humans has become a consistent part of these urban hamsters' lives. So Vienna's Central Cemetery, where the largest population of hamsters in the city resides, has become a sort of tourist attraction where visitors regularly visit, watch, photograph, and even feed the hamsters despite prohibitions on doing so. And so I spent part of last summer there. And on one of my first visits to the cemetery, I was greeted by a hamster which sort of like fearlessly ran up to me undoubtedly had been conditioned to look at me as a source of food. And at first I was thinking this was like a squirrel back home in Oregon, which will oftentimes try to steal food from you. But this is a critically endangered animal. I thought that's kind of a fascinating dynamic here. So I want to say, like, might we look at urban commensals such as the European hamster as sort of proto-domesticates? So consider the obvious conditioning of hamsters to be more comfortable around humans. And remember that the tolerance or comfort around humans is sort of a commonality across all domesticates. So the relationship between humans and hamsters in Vienna is not one in which the hamsters are being explicitly transformed for human ends, but they have been altered from their more wild counterparts due to acclimating to the urban environment and humans. And so one consistent question that I asked myself during the time I spent around these hamsters was to what degree their world was transforming. So Austria, like many countries in Europe, has strict protective measures for these hamsters, which includes prohibitions on urban development that is not mindful to their presence. And there is clearly a recognition that they are present in human spaces, and their presence is even seen as a point of pride for many people. They're protected, especially since being added to the IUCN Red List in 2020. But I want to ask whether the question of what it is to be a European hamster. So certainly, their world has transformed significantly in the last 100 years. And in many ways, their ancestors would certainly not recognize the current world that these urban hamsters occupy. And so I see it as important for us to ask if there's a certain essence or a way of living that is indicative to this species. So in her capabilities approach, Martha Nussbaum refers to empowering the unique forms of flourishing indicative to each species as being sort of central to our moral project. The thought is that part of our moral relationships with other animals involves respecting the fulfillment of what it is to be each particular form of life. So certainly one key element of domestication is the modification of brain size and intelligence of the domesticate, so some to higher degrees than others. And this undoubtedly greatly alters the cognitive processes of the animal and the way of life that's specific to certain species, yet it extends beyond brain functioning. For much of the world of these hamsters has also been greatly altered. So discussing the implications of genetic modification on the self.
Bjørn? Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you because it's really, really interesting, but I think we have about like a minute or so.
Okay.
So if you
okay, so I'll just cut out a little bit here and just conclude. But I want to say that So I want to say that thinking about these kind of critically endangered animals living in urban spaces, I want to say that possibly, like, we think that we can look at like a directed pathway as actually being maybe respectful, like directly, maybe intentionally engaged in a process of domestication to sort of preserve certain capacities. Remember the example of the donkey, in which humans intentionally preserve certain capacities in these animals. I want to say perhaps we can also take an approach like this with animals such as these hamsters that are living among us, rather than letting a sort of commensal pathway play out in which they're sort of altered in ways that we are not necessarily intentionally engaged in, right? So yeah, I mean, I want to say that in contrast to sort of framing domestication as a limitation on other species or as inherently exploitative, we could take an intentional sort of non-anthropocentric approach to the directed domestication of many wild animals. And this could actually be sort of liberatory, especially if they're going to continue to exist in a world that is, so greatly altered by humans that tends to oftentimes not respect their existence. So a hands-off or non-interference approach with regard to other animals is also, on my account, likely not even possible if their lives are going to continue to intersect with humans. So therefore, my conclusion would be that it's sort of incumbent upon us to choose productive and respectful ways to shape our relationships with one another. And part of this might be engaging in a form of sort of intentional domestication of such species. Okay, thank you. Sorry for going over a little bit there.
Okay, no, thank you. It was really, really intriguing and really wonderful research. I think also in a sense, the idea of animals' adaptation to the Anthropocene is already thought-provoking in terms of how the human civilization is trying to amend the current global situation in terms of ecological and climate crisis. And Also, I'm not entirely sure if it's optimistic or not, but we can also leave this to the Q&A, I think. So thank you, and we will now move to our next speaker, who is the last presenter of this panel. We have with us Rick Kelaher from Canisius College. Rick, can you share your presentation?
Absolutely, thank you, Emma. Okay. All right, everybody seeing this?
Yes, looks great, thank you.
All right, beautiful. Greetings from Brooklyn, New York. My name is Rick, and I'm a student at Canisius College and taking a master's program in anthrozoology. I'm here today to talk to you about the current conflict surrounding cats in Western society, but more than that, I want to talk about the social framework and mind space we put animals into, and the forces that can change it very suddenly with real-world implications for the animals involved. We position ourselves to animals mentally by known parameters, experience, acculturation to the larger cultural memory. So before we encounter hide or hair of an animal, we have certain biases baked in, and multiple versions of this classification can exist in a given society. Borea Sachs introduced the idea of animal as tradition, human transposed ethnicity on animals. I also wrote the first draft of this paper for a class I was fortunate enough to take taught by William Lynn, and his work on ethical human animal geography, particularly around predators and the domesticated cat, helped further refine my understanding not only of cats as an animal tradition, but also frameworks and paradigms, how ideas transform or inform our conception of the world, and how this plays out materially. Finally, Dr. Lynn encouraged me to evaluate the notion of a moral panic, what he identified famously as being the nature of the current virulent anti-cat sentiment permeating society. So, news to no one, it's a pretty goddamn hard time to be a cat. Australia is the nightmare scenario, sweeping legislation targeting homeless cats for extermination, prohibitions against TNR with serious legal consequences, and a decided cultural shift on the idea of the cat in Australia as a transgressive invader destroying the environment. This is epitomized by Kate Kessing, who in 2007 submitted a cat stew recipe to a contest in the Alice Springs Desert Festival. Utilizing a cat she trapped, killed, and butchered. Kessing since used the controversy as a platform to advocate further slaughter and consumption of non-endemic species as a patriotic, environmentally minded thing to do for Australians, animal cruelty as victory garden, if you will. This mindset is spreading, including here in New York State, where a bill providing for the allocation of funds for TNR as a humane population management for cats was vetoed by then Governor Andrew Cuomo, who echoed Kessing's sentiments. Not surprisingly, this was lauded by many conservation and ornithological groups, and was likely they who had Cuomo's ear. These large, well-funded organizations generally control both the cultural and scientific narrative, and it's no conspiracy to see a connection between popular expressions of allurophobia, the ivory tower, advocacy groups, and legislation. And there are dangerous real-world implications for both cats and people. There is a unified front facing off against cats, and my paper explains why the ground is so fertile for efforts to take root by comparing it to 3 previous modern historic episodes of radical paradigm shifts with negative consequences for animals. Now, moral panics. Moral panic is a reaction by society to a set of problems or circumstances wherein a folk devil becomes a scapegoat of all this anxiety and becomes persecuted. Folk devils are typically characterized by being the sort of thing that is easy to stigmatize, and also by its lack of a causal relationship with the problem at hand. Those at the margins of society, including animals, are frequent targets. Likewise, these folk devils likely already have many existing associations within the cultural memory, so regardless of the relationship of these agents to the matter at hand, it feels right to target them, playing into confirmation bias. Since folk devils rarely are in positions of power or have many safeguards, they are satisfying and effective to take on if you want to feel like you're doing something. Moral panics also have the advantage of being able to make their case in bite-sized, oversimplified statements, as opposed to nuanced and complicated realities of a given situation. They are perfect for today's TikTok and soundbite world. This paper doesn't seek to get into the specifics about felines and the various ecosystems where they can now be found. This is a complex issue requiring examinations of impact, historic baselines, and ethical considerations. But that's exactly the point. A shift in paradigm is characterized by just assuming that cats are bad for the environment and should be addressed with extermination. It is informed by a moral panic state in our society, as well as some structural problems in conservation science and how we conceptualize the wild. I want us to be self-aware and start to challenge how our perceptions might have a more negative impact on the world around us. I'm going to discuss the aforementioned 3 modern instances of animal paradigm shifts, what happened, what the context was, and based on the definition of a moral panic given, ask if it was a moral panic. The Great Cat and Dog Massacre was brought back to the fore of modern memory by Hilda Keane in her masterpiece, An Animal-Human History of the same name. In reaction to the United Kingdom's declaration of war on Germany in 1939, over the course of 4 days, between 400,000 and 750,000 owned companion animals were euthanized. There were a lot of reasons given for this. Animals were perceived as a potential drain on resources needed for the war effort to come. People anticipated the Blitz would be coming, and euthanasia was chosen as a way to spare animals from suffering. In one notable instance, a parent declared they wished they could offer the same for their children so that they wouldn't have to endure large-scale bombing. This was a popular reaction. Authorities like the RSPCA and British government tried to get people not to euthanize their animals. Likewise, some people scrambled to find alternatives, setting up shelters in the countryside or just putting pets on trains leaving London with notes. After those 4 days and years to come, people regretted what they did to the point where they wouldn't talk about it. And it wasn't appended into the cultural legacy of World War II in Britain because of this. So, the Great Cat and Dog Massacre was not a moral panic, but it does have some overlapping features we can use to help understand the phenomena and the present situation we find ourselves in. The reasons given for euthanasia were mostly centered around preventing animals from consuming resources needed for the war effort, as well as sparing animals suffering in the war. Again, we see these as null. In the cultural context of the time, euthanizing animals was seen as a moral obligation we owed animals to prevent cruelty, so this reaction does kind of make sense. People obviously regretted what they did, but they were caught in a moment. There was nothing they could do to avert risk or prepare, so they found a way to do something significant. The next example. Requisition legislation was passed in most states in the USA around the middle of the last century. This required any city or state city-run shelters or any other animal pound or shelter receiving funding from the state to turn over surplus animals for scientific research. The major driver seems to have come from the biotech lobby, and for a lot of people, it was a surprise when it passed. Thousands of animals were tortured in labs and hospitals across the country, many of whom had probably been pets. Depending on the state, it also permitted animal dealers to collect animals to sell for profit to researchers or schools. Since the first municipal animal shelters was established in Pennsylvania in 1869, colleges, labs, and hospitals have been pressuring those working in the fields of animal protection and welfare to voluntarily surrender unwanted animals. The utility of animals for experimentation is questionable, the financial benefit is dubious, but the scientific and medical community had a demand for them, and it's likely that giving them power denied to others in society had a lot of cultural significance, likely heightened by conflicts between public ethics and medical practices. For example, the doctors' riots of 1788 in New York City, attacks by medical students on Henry Bergh in the mid-19th century, and in the early 20th century, the Brown Dog Affair in Britain. Culture in America following World War II was already pro-science, particularly with the nuclear finale of the conflict. The US existed in an unprecedented rivalry with the Soviet Union. In addition to the proxy conflicts of the era, scientific innovation and trying to prove which ideology could provide its people the best life or advanced civilization was how the contest would be decided, most famously with the space race. In addition to exponentially increasing funding for science, scientific lobbies such as the National Society for Biomedical Research gained a lot of influence. Using this influence, they went after animals. This changed the paradigm of cruelty. Cruelty is harm in excess of necessity. In the context of the existential crisis of the Cold War, combined with the clout held by scientists and doctors, this necessity became sufficient to justify the torture of animals without question. of the necessity of the ethics. The scientist wasn't just an expert in the field, they were deferred to because of high social rank. So this was not a moral panic, but it is relevant to understanding the current fight around cats. In common with the previous incident, there was an existential crisis. This motivated a paradigm shift or a change in cultural values, and science had, as mentioned, made an impact on the public mind during the Second World War. The American people were receptive to it as a vested authority with almost, for most people, unimaginable power. As a culture within a larger culture, the scientific community, in particular doctors and medical researchers, had a long-standing institutional fixation on animal experimentation. They took this opportunity of increased power to go after what they wanted. The paradigm change of this is worth stressing. Previously, society was against this kind of treatment of animals, and anti-cruelty laws put into place by SPCA movements helped to codify that. But this was affected by an aggrieved class, empowered by the circumstances of the context, who framed the narrative around animal experimentation. So finally, I thought Nazi Germany might be a good candidate for evaluation because I'd heard rumors of a large-scale dog cult done in connection with the marshalling of dogs as a resource during the war. I'd initially turned to Boreas Sachs's Animals in the Third Reich, as in my experience, it's been the best history on animals in Nazi Germany. One of Sachs's observations about viewing this culture through an animal lens was that Nazi Germany was not anthropocentric. It's indicated here in this quote, sort of the rationale behind it, but essentially it didn't put people necessarily first so much as a notion of a state. And in that, animals could be privileged over certain humans in that state. In looking at Nazi Germany, what it lends to the understanding of the present conflict around cats is how we conceptualize what belongs and how values of society translate into our conservation and wildlife management practices, as well as other relationships between humans and other animals. So, was it a moral panic? Kinda, maybe. Much of Nazism revolved around the idea of restoring the German state to a fictional historic purity, with corruption from outside forces adulterating this force of race. I do not need to recount the barbarity or cost of this in human terms, particularly at this conference, but I will talk about how this translated into animals. As Sachs's book points out, the Berlin Teutonic Zoo was an example of this, and an organization of nature with wolves at the center and other predators or power mammals in close proximity. This also translated into their scientific programs to breed back the auroch and archaic horses. The value they placed on certain purebred dogs, or even their focus on wilderness restoration and management. None of this was based on scientific proof so much as a romanticized Wagnerian primeval and appealing fiction that felt right to a lot of the Nazi leadership. I don't think this reordering and purging of society along racial hierarchy was necessarily a moral panic, but I think it was far too structured and deliberate to be that. But it seems something similar in that it took a problem and the anxieties of society and scapegoated it onto things unrelated to them, which were pursued with extreme prejudice. The present war on cats, as Lin and et al. Put forward, we are in the midst of a moral panic, with the folk devils being targeted are cats. The explanation from the perpetrators being put forward are that cats are environmental catastrophes made manifest, invasive predators exterminating vulnerable native wildlife, particularly birds. Culturally, our idea of cats fits that role. And the status of the cat is such that we don't question either the assessment or the necessity of extermination. Likewise, they make an ideal scapegoat, particularly for certain worldviews that are prone to criticize in terms of colonizer or carnivore. The existential crisis is the environment. Society is whipped into a frenzy and desperately wants to do something about it. This has led us to a point of paradigm shift where we are projecting our anxieties onto nature and society in terms of what belongs and what does not belong, what is pure and natural and what is adulteration. The opportunistic actors are many in conservation ecology or field biology community who have long resented feline predation on endemic wildlife. They are the ones who want to kill first and not really ask questions about the real impact. So, I should have forwarded that before. Possible solutions. How can we correct this? Well, we work together and we don't give in to baser impulses that lead us to panic or persecute. There's no reason why people who are for the welfare and kind treatment towards cats, whatever their status, and people working in conservation biology should not get along and have the same motivations. We look at the complicated reality of ecosystems where cats exist to ascertain real impact. We need to revisit the nature paradigm in terms of our conservation and management work and recognize that a lot of environments are now hybrid. We need to recognize the cat is also an innocent actor in all this and seek justice and mercy in dealing with all animals impacted by this conflict. And this means we need to prioritize and consider non-lethal solutions ahead of lethal ones. I just ask that we look, stop, and act compassionately. So that is my presentation. Always happy to connect with kindred spirits and fellow travelers down this particular road. Thank you so much for this opportunity and time.
Thank you very much, Rick. I think first for delving into this highly controversial issue, and second for offering this theoretical and moral framework to address its root causes and perceptions, which is obviously a much better starting point for a complex discussion, but is also applicable to other human-animal conflicts, or at least what is framed as conflicts. So I'm very happy to, I'm very thankful to all of you for these presentations, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Dafna Shir-Vertesh from Achva College, who will comment on these presentations.
Thank you, Amnon, and I would like to join you in thanking all three presenters for these very stimulating presentations. There are fascinating themes that connect all three, and I will like to try and weave these together in this discussion and then later address each one separately. So the examination of the wild and domesticated is obviously a discussion about human categorizations. I say obviously, but this is not always so evident. We grow up learning about different categorizations of animals and learn to view them as natural and normal. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss identified the meanings and importance of such classifications. According to him, the mind's ability and propensity to categorize, group, oppose, and mediate establishes its perpetual experience. The eventual outcome of this is that by thinking of animals as well as other aspects of the environment as wild or domesticated, we perpetuate distinctions between nature and culture, animals and humans, selves and others. Indeed, Edmund Leach claims that, and I quote, "It is a fact of empirical observation that human beings everywhere adopt ritual attitudes towards the animals and plants in their vicinity," end quote. He exemplifies how classifications of animals are related to those of humans, and I quote again, "Consider, for example, the separate and often bizarre rules which govern the behavior of Englishmen towards the creatures which they classify as wild animals, foxes, game, farm animals, pets, vermin." Notice further that if we take the sequence of words strangers, enemies, friends, neighbors, companions, criminals, the two sets of terms are in some degree homologous. Okay, so wild animals are equivalent to strangers and vermin to criminals. That is, the categories of animals could metaphorically be, and sometimes are, used as equivalents for the categories of human beings, redefining and demarcating the humans and animal others. So we can utilize animals for purposes of differentiation, to classify ourselves into distinct groups and note the differences. That way we can get a defined perception of identity, of what us is, that is a certain sense of belonging, but of also who they or the others are, those that are outsiders, those that are threatening or unwanted. Since the 1980s, anthropologists have underlined viewpoints beyond the Western, presenting cultural settings in which distinctions between wild and domestic, culture and nature do not seem to occur or are significantly more trivial. But even when they do exist and appear to be significant, these categorizations often become blurry or change over time. For example, as the three excellent talks we have just heard illustrate, the social is never completely removed from the wild. It becomes harder and harder to think about parts of the environment or different species of animals as completely unrelated to human societies and their influence. In this way, all three presentations can be seen as part of a relatively recent scholarly effort to problematize the notions of wild and domesticated and demonstrate how contrived these categorizations are and their inability to hold water. Not only is the wild never really wild in the sense that it is untouched and unaffected by humans, but the traditional conceptualization of domestication has been challenged as well. Domestication is no longer viewed as merely a human feat, but is rather becoming increasingly evident that animals themselves played and still play an important role in this endeavor. Instead of domestication, scholars are now discussing domesticatory practices or domestication pathways, as in Bjørn's analysis. These terms incorporate animal agency while still stressing the importance of human activity that modifies ecologies in ways that affect and shape species and human surroundings. Various species are therefore seen as directly influenced by human action, both physically and behaviorally. Niche construction might prove to be another interesting venue to pursue. See, for example, Fuentes' work from 2004 and 2006. Niche construction takes into account all species' capability and propensity to affect their surroundings and create their own spaces and places. When we think about humans in animal spaces and places and not necessarily human categorizations of animals, we can look into multi-species interactions from a novel perspective. For example, thinking about domestication from this perspective, we can view it as a co-evolution of humans in human and non-human societies, a perspective that bridges social and biological views. This enables us to incorporate more than human agency into the understanding of such processes. All three presentations of this panel and their discussion of animals on the verge between the wild and the domesticated contribute to these attempts to reconsider social and ecological intricacies and promote dynamism in the understanding of cultural representations into the assessment of multi-species boundaries and relations. This enables us to shift our gaze from strict categorizations and differentiations to understandings of interconnectedness between humans and other animals, as well as acknowledging the constructionist quality embedded in these classifications. Both Zuzana's and Bjørn's presentation interrogate the notion of liminality. This concept has been discussed in relation to animals, specifically pets, many times, starting with Leach's categorization mentioned before. Liminality, or the threshold, is ambiguous and can therefore be threatening. But liminal beings, while not easily placed into one clear category, nevertheless represent and highlight the categorical boundaries as they epitomize the co-presence of opposites. At the same time, the talks presented here defy this perception of liminality. For example, they show that ways animals regarded as wild are encroaching both physical boundaries as they invade human living spaces and symbolic spatial boundaries that define what belongs in the human realm and what does not. It is clear that domestication and wildness are not confined groups, but rather constantly vary in degree, both spatially, temporally, and symbolically. For example, while Rick's talk does not directly mention liminality, he does demonstrate the challenges in classifying cats over the centuries. Cats clearly explicate the dynamism in these categorizations and the difficulty in pinning them down as strict bounded units. They can be predators and pets, pests and loved beings, domesticated and semi-wild. What is more, they can be moved along these continuums, flexibly positioned at different parts of the gamut as cultural perceptions and historical circumstances change. It is also for this reason that they elicit strong emotions and biases. It seems that these transgressions and changes in positions and spaces make these liminally positioned animals especially threatening and lead to attempts to manage their movement, behaviors, and population. This also raises the question whether the notion of liminality allows for the agency of the animals. How do the animals themselves and their attributes and behaviors transcend and transgress human-made categorizations? There's a cat right in front of me in the window right now. It's just spooked the hell out of me. Another important aspect that these presentations portray is that these classifications of wild and domesticated are not merely about human conceptualizations or feelings. There are very real consequences of these categorizations. Perhaps this is most evident in Rick's and Zuzana's portrayal of the management of cats and dogs in various settings. Not only are cats or dogs at times viewed as pests and dangers that need to be removed, we are currently facing argumentations that call for the systematic extermination of one species in order to save others. As our understanding of the importance of the environment and myriad of living beings around us grow, we nevertheless continue to realign the somewhat arbitrary borders between what we deem important, worthy, domestic, endemic, and what we consider to be a menace, a pest, wild, and dangerous. In these categorizations, there is room for liminality and uncertainty, as there are animals that reside at the threshold between nature and culture, wild and domesticated. However, and this is very evident in the presentations we just heard, the status of so many animals appears ambiguous or challenged, that perhaps instead of exploring the classifications of animals, we should rather interrogate the ways humans fashion these boundaries and flexibly and dynamically alter both the categorizations and their meanings. In my 2012 article, Flexible Personhood, I call for the examination of the treatment and categorization of companion animals as flexible rather than liminal, since there is continuous dynamism and elasticity in these conceptualizations and the behaviors that ensue. Hearing today's presentation made me wonder if the same is true in these discussions as well. Our perceptions and attitudes to various species change from place to place, from situation to situation, even from one specific animal to another. Let me try to illustrate what I mean here by thinking of the cats and dogs in our surroundings. Companion animals in the house are considered to be children, part of their family. Their animalness is physically and symbolically contained. When the animals are outside, unleashed and unsupervised, the animality of these beings becomes clearer. They growl, tear open garbage bags, leave their defecations lying around, may form a pack. The more these behaviors occur, it becomes harder to hide that these are in fact non-persons, even if they belong to species that in the house are seen to be persons. In fact, outside their defined human spaces, companion dogs and cats may change their baby or childlike identity and become to be perceived as menaces and threats. We can break this down even further, and I will focus here on dogs. We treat our dogs and the dogs of others, small dogs and large dogs, familiar dogs and strange dogs, differently. And furthermore, each dog in itself represents a spectrum of animalness, ranging from the dog in the house as a baby, through the leash dog as an extension of self and the unattended dog that may posit risks, to the feral animal other that threatens our very existence. Rather than seeing the animals explored in these presentations as nature-culture hybrids, what we Latourian moderns have not succeeded in purifying, I favor the notion of flexibility to explain the multitude of ways we try to contain or enable animal mobility, behavior, and population. To conclude, the categorizations of wild, domesticated, and liminal animals can be seen as significant difference and otherness-generating apparatuses, implicating inequalities of risk, rights, and status, constantly negotiating the meanings of both animalness, but also humanness. Such modes of constructing boundaries are about defining what the human is versus the animal or subhuman other. The classifications of wild and domesticated, much like Leach's categorizations, probably tell us more about humans than about animals. These were my thoughts as I read the papers as a whole, but Amnon, is there time? Because I have questions that I would like to address to each of the presenters, but you just let me know if we have time for that.
Yeah, I mean, we have 10 minutes, so I think part of that can be your questions, and we have also a question from the audience.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick, just a quick question to each one. To Zuzana, your recount of animal management advantages and disadvantages is very thorough and very important. I would like to ask you, incorporating various notions from previous talks we heard yesterday and today, how can we flip our perspective and think perhaps instead of animal management about moral responsibility, empathy, or ethical cohabitation? Can the animal's perspectives, needs, and well-being be incorporated more into what you term the responses to the stray problem? To Bjørn, and I'll just ask all three questions and then we can turn to you. And I will stop. to Bjørn, the idea that domestication and anthrodependency can actually benefit animals is very intriguing. It made me think about it a lot. But when I was thinking about your proposal, I read a longer version than what you presented here. And you were talking about pursuing non-anthropocentric domestication. And when you were discussing the example of donkeys, you acknowledged that they were domesticated for human use and mentioned that they were allowed to engage in behaviors that humans did not intentionally choose for them. And it seemed to me to still be quite anthropocentric. So do you think it's actually possible for humans to directly domesticate animals without being anthropocentric? And if so, how? And what kind of agency, if any, will animals have in such a process? And to Rick, the historical cases and the way you tie them together really offers a new perspective on these animal management practices and specifically our relationship with cats. I think it would be interesting to think about or incorporate intersectionality when you talk about your discussion of cat hunts. So it's very clear when we think about the example of Nazi Germany, but it might be useful when you're thinking about other cases as well. It seems that the wish to purge what is perceived of as unclean, out of place, out of control, and dangerous connects various forms of otherness. So it can be cats, dogs, rats, but also Jews, gypsies, and other groups, ethnic, sexual, etc. So could it be the case that these moral panics, as you call them, are ultimately about the fear of otherness, whether animal or otherness, that are penetrating symbolic and physical boundaries of human communities? Thank you very much.
So I think maybe Bjørn, you want to address the question?
Yeah, sure. I can try to answer that question. Thank you so much for your excellent comments to all the papers. Yeah, so definitely I'm not making the argument in this paper that the domestication of donkeys was not done through, like, as you said, right? It was not done through a non-anthropocentric perspective. But again, I think also, like, it depends what's meant by anthropocentrism here. Like, I think that there's certainly, I think it's possible to avoid a sort of ethical anthropocentrism, but perhaps not a conceptual anthropocentrism. There's a sense in which perhaps it's very difficult or impossible, right, for humans to step outside the perspective of a particular, context of being, human in relationship to the world. But I think with, like, the integration of, like, ethology, animal behavior, perhaps we can, like, come to understand better if there is a certain sort of, telos or essence to a particular species that's perhaps what Tom Van Doren refers to as a flight way. This is not just looking at the species as this, like, stagnant category that they are right now, but perhaps how they have existed through a span of time and how they will continue to exist into the future. And perhaps, right, the commensal pathway could be seen as, right, these are unintentional processes that are playing out oftentimes, which are definitely having an effect on animals and developing sort of like dependencies and radical changes in the species. If we were to take an intentional process, a directed pathway towards species, like, for example, the European hamster, in conjunction with sort of considering a host of research, like, for example, ethological research, perhaps there could be an approach that would intentionally preserve certain capacities within these species with a kind of attention to, like, obviously they're existing in relationship with humans, but how can we sort of take into account that we can't avoid modifying the species, but modify them in a way that sort of respects the sort of integrity to them or a sort of autonomy, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a long discussion that I don't want to take all the time, but, like, thank you. It's a very good point to bring up. Thanks.
Thank you. Zuzana, do you want to respond to Dafna's question?
Yes, hello. So I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conference, and thank you also for your thought-provoking comment. And as you said, liminal animals can never be limited to one category. They represent a threshold between wild and domesticated species. they are perceived as threats on one hand, and I do believe that we can flip our empathy and ethical cohabitation, or at least we have to try to better understand particular species and their needs on one hand, and try to manage to limit their movements in order to smoothly cohabitate with humans on the other hand. If you want to ask me more questions, hopefully I have answered your question correctly. So I think that we can flip our empathy and ethical cohabitation with liminal animals, or at least stray animals, as I was talking about cats and dogs, especially. They are the most like emotionally intriguing to human, so they have a good chance to be threat ethically, and rather than, for example, rats or other animals that they don't have such a good, and they don't evoke such good or positive emotions like, for example, dogs and cats. So it's a long way to go, but I think we can manage to cohabitate with them in ethical and empathetical way, I think.
Thank you very much, Zuzana, for elaborating on this. I think we just have a couple minutes. So, Rick, if perhaps can you address Dafna's question, and I'll also read one from the chat, and maybe you can answer them both. So this is from Eduardo Balona Corrado. He's first of all saying thank you, and asking you, Rick, do you think that the One Health concept is strong enough to overcome the barriers between humans and non-humans when there is a situation of moral panic? What do you think could be a non-anthropocentric solution in this case?
Well, first and foremost, I'm really excited to have about 3 minutes to solve the problem of othering and the shortcomings of human nature. Call me cocky, but I think I got this one. But no, you know, it really does come down to our basal impulses. And again, the theme of an outgroup, the othering, is just such a perpetual recurring tragedy in just human existence. But reframing things, and to tie the two together, one of the big benefits of One Health is kind of reframing things. Now, my own view of civilization is that we needed to separate fields of learning so that we could refine them. And one moment. Sorry, I'm having difficulty coexisting with Alexa. But basically, you know, we refined knowledge as far as we could. We sharpened it. We all became experts in our various fields. And in the course of doing that, we lost sight of what other people are doing. So hybrid disciplines like anthrozoology, the big thing we bring is that we're kind of looking at what others are doing, and the big developments that come in fields these days are just seeing what others have known for a very long period of time. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that, at least in terms of reframing what we're looking at, you know, in terms of One Health, for example, if we think about what our base objectives are, you know, maybe we start with human health, maybe we start with the environment, we see all things are interconnected, and we start to wonder, rather than holding on to some notion of how things should be, what they are, in our mind, working towards something, trying to preserve something that doesn't exist or never existed, we can kind of see what it is to be healthy. We can also see the common ground. It also really, hopefully, will get us to stop and say, okay, well, looking at differences, like, you know, just being objective and having a good knowledge of history, like, okay, like I use some certain examples that I think kind of clearly illustrate aspects of what's going on today. Just knowing that, I think brings a degree of self-awareness to keep us from really doing it again. I mean, how do we break the cycle is always the question. And I'm optimistic, perhaps surprisingly. I think it can be done, but it's certainly not easy. So I don't think I answered either question.
No, I think you did, and I think you're also right. You got this right on time. So thank you very much. This was a really wonderful session and really interesting talks. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, a little bit over time, so we'll have to stop here, even though it did intrigue more questions, and also I had some more questions. So I might get you on that over email or something, and I'm also welcoming everybody who wants to ask more questions to contact us. And we have the email on the website, and we'll also put it in the chat. And we can pass on your questions to the panelists. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, please stay with us for the next and last session of this evening and the conference Endangered, poetry reading by poet Gordon Mead. We'll take just 2 minutes to organize and then we will start. Thank you again.